Now, in the previous video, we had talked about the influence of peer pressure on our students, and that some students are more susceptible to peer pressure than others, especially in adolescence. Students with low esteem, low confidence, students who have weak family relationships, and that as teachers, we have a great opportunity to help develop students' self-esteem, help them understand from a conceptual standpoint a strong self-concept. We also talked about Erickson's theory and how we go through a series of crises throughout our lifetime, and each time we resolve these crises, these dilemmas, it adds another piece to our overall psychosocial development. And that in the K through 12 years, we primarily focused on three. We focused on initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority, and identity versus identity diffusion. And the role there is that as teachers, we play an integral part in helping our students get a better sense of themselves. Do we want to build a sense of initiative? Do we want to build a sense of industry? How do we help shape students' identity? We talked about Marcia's stages and how students will experience a state of confusion or diffusion, and with more exploration and commitments that they can hopefully come closer to a sense of identity achievement, which we recognize doesn't necessarily happen in high school. We also talked about, the physical features, the changes that are occurring in young boys and young girls and into adolescence, and how those can impact how a student sees themselves, how they feel about themselves, and again, influence their peer relations, right? In this video, we're going to focus on the changing aspects of our students' social emotional learning. We'll focus on emotions and some of the emotional aspects. And you'll notice from the very beginning of this unit, we talked about how cognition plays an integral role in helping them develop a greater sense of self-esteem, identity, stronger peer relations, etc. So by cognition, I'm focusing on students' ability to think and to reason, and how those can impact our students. Well, when you think about emotional and personal development, before you start getting into that, I would like for you to think for a minute of all the emotions. If you can, if you have a pen and paper, write down all the emotions that you can come up with, all right? And how do you experience those different emotions? If you need to, go ahead and pause the video, but just think down, just write down as many emotions as you can right now. And what many of you will find is, it's crazy because I talk to students all the time about this, but we think about how we experience so many different emotions, and many times we'll say our emotions are all over the place. We're on this wide continuum, and you think that there's more than 100 different emotions that that you are feeling. But when you actually have to put pen to paper and write down all the emotions, we find, I do anyhow, find that many times we're at 12, 13, 15 emotions, and then we start wondering, well, is anger much different than, how does anger or sadness and being unhappy, and are they kind of the same thing? And what we find is that students experience emotion in any number of different ways, and as a result of that, as a teacher, we focus on, what are the influences of student emotion? Where do they come from? And and what guides the student in those different types of emotions. Now, in emotional development, as a teacher, when we think about emotion and we contrast that with temperament, okay, what is emotion? What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about a complex constellation of physiological, behavioral, and feelings that have an impact on students' performance. Now, when you start thinking about things like temperament, what does that mean? Well, temperament is more of a genetically based individual difference in emotion. How do they control their behavior? Okay, how do they respond to certain stimuli and certain events? Now they're very different because emotion is can be in the moment, whereas temperament is oftentimes something that is with our students at a very young age. So who they are as toddlers or preschoolers or early elementary is oftentimes the same kind of person they are when they are junior high and high school. How do they handle change? How do they handle strong emotions elicited by others? Whereas, again, temperament is more of a consistent pattern of behavior, whereas emotion, you could see a great deal more fluctuation. Okay? So, there are a number of different features of emotional development that we focus on as teachers now, or the importance of it. All right. First and foremost, as a teacher, we like to think about how do I help my students as they enter into adulthood? How do I prepare them for that? And it starts at a very young age. And one of the things that we think about is how do we help them identify and understand their own feelings? When children are very young, they feel the emotions very plainly, very clearly. You can see it, they express them. But they can't necessarily put words to what those feelings are. That's why a lot of times teachers will say, when you see a student is really angry, they're frustrated, they're upset, you'll ask them, what are you feeling? Like, why do you feel this way? Or what are you thinking? Or whatever else. And they just don't know. And they're just really mad or they're really upset. And so part of that is just a cognitive feature. You haven't had lots of experiences with these emotions. You don't know how to put it into words. And so a lot of times in early childhood and elementary school, teachers spend time just helping students to be able to identify and understand those feelings. Okay? We also realize that over time we become better at reading and comprehending the feelings of others. You'll hear a term that we'll talk about in classes and in the book. You think about egocentrism. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, it's when you basically are focusing more on yourself than you are on the feelings of others. So when someone is very egocentric, that means they don't see what the other people see. They just see it from their point of view. Well, young kids are very egocentric, and part of that is that they're always worried about and thinking about how does it impact them, or how do they, what does it mean to them? And what happens is they miss a lot of cues just from what other people are when they're expressing emotions. And so, as a teacher, caregiver, parent, we spend time helping students learn to read and comprehend the emotions of others. As they get older, they need to learn to better able to manage strong emotions and their expressions. When you are a first grader, second grader, third grader, and things aren't going your way, you understand when they might throw a tantrum. You might understand why they're so visibly upset. But as they get older, what happens is those strong emotions, if they were to demonstrate those, they're throw a tantrum, get all visibly upset in front of everybody else, that might actually create more problems, or it might put them in a more awkward place. Remember we talked about status, and sometimes kids might be rejected for certain reasons. Well, one might be if you feel awkward around that person because they are not in control of their emotions. So we talk to kids about the importance of how those emotions are manifest themselves. We also learn that through years, kids begin better able at regulating their behavior, and hopefully with time and practice and conversations, we help students develop a greater sense of empathy for others. And that's not something that is just automatic as well. You know, just because you get older that you suddenly are more empathetic. That is something that we find that teachers and parents can have a strong influence on our students if we want them to become more empathetic, as well as establishing and sustaining relationships. What is involved in a healthy relationship, and how do we help our students sustain those relationships over time? Now, in the PowerPoint, you'll notice that I have a series of trends, of developmental trends, from children to late adolescence. And what I want you to be able to recognize is that when children are really young, they talk about 3 to 7 years of age up until around second grade. If you take a look at the characteristics of how those emotions manifest themselves within that age group and how they're able to regulate those things, you're going to find a common theme, like we saw in friendships and peer interactions and self-esteem. You're going to find that when children are relatively young, their cognitive skills, their self-awareness, their emotional awareness, their reasoning skills, all of those things are relatively immature. And as a result of those things, you're going to find that the emotional trends are also going to be a kind of a byproduct of their ability to think and to reason. When they're really young, you'll see them, there's that emergence of self-conscious emotions. They begin to recognize the emotions of others as they get into first grade and second grade, and that comes from again, a greater cognitive skill to be able to see the differences in others and to be able to compare those things. As you get a little bit older and you get into that 8 to 10 years of age, 3rd through 5th grade, students start to develop a greater sense of self. They learn how to relate to emotions. They understand the emotions of others, mixed emotions of others. They learn rules for displaying emotions. That comes from just social interaction. More social interaction, students learn what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and they start to develop greater emotional coping skills. Like, you can't just throw a tantrum. You could maybe in kindergarten, but in 4th grade, that's probably not going to be very well received. And so as kids get older, they start to understand what's appropriate and what's not appropriate reactions to emotionally charged situations. And as they get older, especially in those junior high years, you start having a combination of, remember we talked about students wanting to fit in, greater acceptance, the cliques start to really take place. Now you throw on top of that the physical hormonal changes that are going on with many of the kids, and you're going to see some greater mood swings, okay? You're going to see that at the same time they're going to be struggling with a sense of autonomy, wanting to be by themselves. They might rely on their peers more for emotional support because they're trying to distance themselves away from their parents a little bit. That's a growing phase. We see those kind of things. And what happens is, in that period, that junior high period, kids, our students are starting to try to figure out who they are, how they're independent, what they can do, and they step away from the family a little bit, and then they rely a little bit more on their peers. And that's why that emotional support comes in so handy. And as they get older into high school, you'll see that they'll have greater emotional stability because of experience, as well as self-awareness, social awareness, emotional understanding, okay? They still rely on their parents, on their peers, and they actually start to incorporate some of their parents' ideas more because some of the things that the parents were saying when they were younger are now starting to come to fruition, and they start saying, oh, maybe my parents weren't that far off the base. They have greater emotional control and certainly greater sophisticated coping skills because of that experience. Now, when you think about emotional intelligence as a teacher, we work to our students to become more independent, more self-regulated, more emotionally available and aware. You know, we have a lot of different things that are set aside from just the content that we teach in our classroom. Daniel Goleman talks about, and I have this in one of the slides, that Daniel Goleman talks about emotional intelligence, okay? Are our students able to perceive, express, understand, and manage emotions? Students that are able to do those things, it is to their benefit than those who struggle in those other areas. And he talks about 5 main areas. 1, emotional understanding. 2, being able to respond to appropriately to other people's emotions. To regulate your own emotions. To self-motivate at times, as well as develop strong emotional relationships. Now, there's a difference between, when we think about dimensions of emotional intelligence, one of the dimensions that that the book discusses, and you see in the other areas of literature, is emotional understanding, ability to differentiate one and interpret one's own emotion. When kids are really young, they're not very good at it. They don't have the experience, and they don't know how to put to words what they're feeling. And so emotional understanding is something that comes with age. Self-awareness, the ability to recognize your own thoughts and feelings and to act on them, again, something that comes with age. When children are young, their emotional understanding is weak, and typically their self-awareness is relatively weak. Self-awareness comes from getting feedback from teachers, parents, peers. We become more self-aware and more emotionally understanding with the more experiences that we have. Heck, there are still plenty of adults that struggle in this area. Why is that? Sometimes they've never had the appropriate feedback. Sometimes they never utilize any sort of critical reflection about their own experiences. I laugh because I'm a big sports person, and when I watch certain sports, I can see that there are some people that are out on the court or out on the field that are in it for themselves. They demonstrate very egocentric characteristics, not much of a team player, and sometimes they don't even realize when their own behavior is detrimental to their own team's success. Well, that's an absence of self-awareness. You don't know your part in the process. And so as kids get older, we often learn from our feedback from teachers and parents and peers that that we play a part. And when we reflect on what part we play, we hopefully eventually become a little bit more self-aware. Now, how do we use this stuff in our own classrooms? Well, one of the things that we have to realize is that we want our students to become emotionally understanding, and we play a part in that. One of the things that teachers can really do well is to model self-reflective language. That means when I get upset, I use a talk aloud method, and I try to express myself as to why I'm feeling upset. Or if I'm really anxious, or if I'm really excited about something, when I explain my feelings and I use terms or language, my students are able to pick up on that and understand, be able to connect the two. These are the type of behaviors that are characteristic of this emotion. Use the words, students start developing their own way to communicate about that. Certainly create opportunities to talk about positive and negative feelings. Give students in learning to identify complex emotions, and then the language to express themselves. That's the thing. When they're really young, they lack the ability to articulate how they feel, and as teachers, if we can model that, then we're preparing them for to deal with those emotions themselves. We also want to be able to help our students understand and to interpret and to respond to others appropriately. When you take a look at the social emotional learning standards in the state of Illinois, and I will more than likely put those up on, make those available to you. we want to be able to say that uh, uh, that as a participant in a school, classroom, or community, we have to learn to be able to identify our part in in the role that we play in good, healthy relationships. And part of that means that we need to be able to look to our peers, look to our friends, and when we see that that we've done something to upset them, understand what role we played in that. And that comes from, again, like I said, from experience. But you can also do a lot of activities where students can develop better perspective taking skills, like how would it feel if you were in this situation? Or you can watch videos, you can use narratives or stories and talk about the emotions that somebody might be feeling in the story and why they feel that way. Certainly, we want to encourage our students to start to exhibit or to practice empathetic behavior. Now, empathetic behavior is we're talking about trying to put yourself in the shoes of someone else. How might they feel? Again, when we're dealing with some egocentric behavior, it's a little bit more difficult for them to develop that empathetic behavior. But we can model ways of how what it looks like to be empathetic. Sometimes people think of empathy kind of like sympathy, like you feel sorry for them or you hope that things go better. No, empathy is more of an understanding, um, an, uh, an exercise in trying to understand how someone else might feel. And so a lot of times empathy is something that is learned through experience, and teachers can play a big part in that. We want our students to, as they get older, to begin to regulate their own emotional responses better, and how we manage situations where we might be a little bit upset. Using modeling, direct instruction is certainly always a great way to help them. Again, provide strategies, provide training. You think about classroom management issues. How do students learn to resolve issues? Well, sometimes we help them with conflict resolution. We talk about using I statements as opposed to talking about them. Like, well, they did this and they should have and he did this. What about I? How does I feel this way? Or when someone says this, it hurts me because. You start to talk about it, and you teach the students to be able to express themselves in a meaningful way. Then you can have greater regulation of emotional responses. Now, self-motivation is something that we hope for many of our students, and that is that we talk about it from a self-regulation standpoint. How are they able to develop a sense of autonomy while at the same time recognize that we can't have teachers there all the time for us to motivate them to do certain things? How do they take it upon themselves to become more independent, self-regulated learners? Well, some of that stems from self-motivation. How do we help students become self-motivated? Well, one is we have to give them very concrete, specific feedback. If students are struggling in an area, we need to provide them with where they're struggling, why they're struggling, and how they might be able to change that. If we don't provide them that feedback, then the students don't know how to identify the strengths or how they can build on what they've already learned. We encourage our students always to keep trying their best. Give them meaningful lessons that connect with the student's life. That's a great way to help provide motivation. And giving them opportunities for success. Sometimes that's the greatest opportunity to learn about self-motivation, is putting them in a position to be successful. If you're not in a position to be successful and you fail quite often, many students can start to develop what they refer to as a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, I don't get this, I can't get this, I'll never get this, so why bother? Well, that's kind of counterintuitive to the idea of self-motivation. And we want to provide students opportunity for success. Now, Why do we talk about emotion within the classroom? Well, one reason is that emotion has a powerful impact on students' success in the classroom. Students learn and perform more successfully when they are secure, happy, and excited about the subject. All right. When students harbor negative emotions, we find that when they come into a task negatively, it can oftentimes hamper student performance. It's kind of like when a person goes up to bat. If they're already making excuses for why they're going to strike out, or that, oh, I'm the last out, or thinking that they're going to perform poorly to begin with, well, what we're going to find is, and what the research shows, is that kids who think they can't do worse than kids who think they can. So it does no one any good to walk up to the free throw line or to the spelling bee contest already saying how you're going to lose. So in the classroom, we recognize that emotion does have a big impact on it, and we want to encourage those things. Now, how do students develop into the person that they become as a high schooler and as college students and as young adult? It's a series of experiences, right? How do we become better students academically? Probably from a series of experiences that we've had in K through 12. Good teachers, good learning strategies, good opportunities for success, tutors, all those things. Well, the same is true for emotions. Who are we? How do we become the person that we are from an emotional standpoint? Well, now if you go back to Erickson's theory, and talks about how we have these crises, these dilemmas, and if we resolve them successfully, that it helps. Well, go back and think about the very first one, trust versus mistrust. If you were a young toddler and you had people coming and going in and out of your life, very chaotic home, there might be some issues of trust. Until you resolve those issues of trust, Erickson would say that it's not going away. Well, from an emotional standpoint, emotional development standpoint, one of the things that you'll hear people talk about at a very young age with children is a set or understanding of attachment. Were the children securely attached to the parent, to the mother, or to the parents, or to the siblings? What do we mean by attachment? We're talking about close, affectionate bonds that serve as the foundation for future relationships. That means, and you take a look at Ainsworth's work, even Harlow's work, you're going to find that kids that are securely attached, strongly attached, that there are some real benefits to that. It starts early on with the relationships that children have with their parents. We also realize that a part of that relationship is the characteristics, the temperamental characteristics that the child has themselves. Remember, temperament is that genetic-based aspect of it, as well as the cultural context. So, young children that have strong attachments with their siblings and their parents, or a parent, and they have a temperament that is relatively easygoing, you put them into any sort of cultural context, any sort of different environment, you find that those children will be able to be very responsive, emotionally, do well. Children that struggle with issues of attachment, okay, meaning they do not have strong affectionate bonds, well, now going forward, that's going to impede their future relationships in some way. Now, on top of that, if they have a temperament that is more difficult, meaning that they're less likely to respond to change very well. Well, you can see how that's going to make a big difference. Now, when you take a look at the theories and you take a look at attachment, when you think about those developmental changes that occur during attachment at a very young age, those figures, those people that are involved, we're talking about siblings, we're talking about our parents and our friends at a very young age. And what we find is that those who, there is different components of attachment. And one way you can look at the young toddler who uses their parents as a safe haven, okay, a person to go if they're afraid. They have someone to go to. Well, what happens if a young child doesn't have that person to go to, that adult figure, that sibling to go to? They're kind of left on their own to do that. Well, that creates a very different type of attachment. When children are young, they like to use their parents as kind of a home base or as a secure base, which they know if that you're here, then they feel like they can explore. They have the power and the capability to go to explore. Because if all else fails, I've got a secure base and someone I can come home to. If you've ever watched young kids, there are some kids that are hugging their mother's hip or their father's by their father's side or siblings. They're very unlikely or very reluctant to actually go out and talk to people, to venture far from where their parent or sibling is. And that's because they don't feel very confident in the relationship that they might have there. And as a result, their exploration is going to be somewhat minimized. Okay? And certainly, I laugh because some of you might have seen in the video, the dog in the video here. But my nephew who lives here that's his dog, Keita, and she experiences a lot of emotional distress when John or when some of us leave the room or leave the house, and you can hear her whimpering and crying and she's only 7 or 8 months old, but you see that. Well, that's the same thing for young children. When they don't have those attachments in place, you can feel a lot of social anxiety or distress in those situations. Now, there are different types of attachment, okay? We can talk, and you guys, you've seen this perhaps in movies, in movies, or perhaps talked about in other environments. But when you talk about attachment, we have 3 different types of attachment. We have those that are securely attached. We have those that are insecurely attached. And that might be either, in the insecurely attached, might be those who are avoidant insecurely attached, avoidant, or maybe insecurely attached, resistant. Now, most of the kids that we have in our classroom have generally a strong bond or supportive relationship with family members or people at home. That would be that securely attached. A smaller portion are the insecurely attached individuals. Now, what does that mean for us as it comes to teachers? Well, what happens is those kids that are securely attached are more likely to be able to explore. They are also more likely to have good, positive relationships. And be more sensitive to other people's needs. Well, those that are more insecurely attached might have a less, not very explorative, maybe a little bit more emotionally distant, especially the avoidant group, tend to be disengaged from their peers, or may be disengaged from the adult relationship. And you can see how the insecurely attached individual can also be a little bit more anxious and perhaps a little bit more insecure. Sometimes those insecure or anxious behaviors can lead to people being a little bit more, they're a little bit more bursts of anger, or they might represent their feelings a little bit more, let's say sporadically, but might those emotions might manifest very different than the person that is more securely attached. Now, I mentioned to you before about how temperament is kind of a genetically based aspect, and what we see is that temperament plays a part in our classrooms as well. We have different types of temperament. We have kids that are easy or flexible. They're generally calm, happy, not very easily upset, very easily adapt. So when you change things in the last minute, for your class, or like, let's try this, or we were going to do this, but let's go outside and we'll work on that later. Well, some kids that are not easy or flexible, that creates a big deal. But for the easy temperament people, students, they're kind of go with the flow person. Now, the reason I bring this up is because we think that temperament is different than emotion. Emotion is a manifestation of perhaps of an experience or even a certain condition. Now, if you have an easy temperament, your emotion is going to be different than that if you are a difficult person, where you might be fearful or high strung or be prone to intense reactions. Your emotion looks very different than the person that has an easy temperament. And so the idea is, as a teacher, when we recognize there are some kids in our classroom that might be either one difficult or feisty, or maybe they're slow to warm up to, is another aspect of temperament. And so as a teacher, we're going to recognize that some students are going to be very reluctant to change. Some students are going to take time for them to be more engaged, more willing to participate. And so our instruction and our lessons are going to take into account that there's different characteristics of people based on their temperament that would influence how they respond to any given situation. Now, as a teacher, I'm always paying attention to how their emotional state can impact their experience for the day. Or for that matter, I've even noticed that sometimes that if you'll notice that when it's really nice outside, how kids can get really antsy, really anxious, very less attentive. Okay, well, why is that? Do you think it's because of just because it's nice somewhere that they're feeling that way? No, what happens is kids are their experiences have more positive experiences and better when it's nice outside. So when they see it's nice outside, their memories kind of tie back to emotion. And they're like, oh, I want to do this or I want to do that. And suddenly they become less attentive because of the emotional uplift that's happening from nice weather. Okay? As a teacher, we are going to see some real changes from when kids are younger, and then you'll see some as they get older. One of the things that we see and they talk about is, and I've mentioned already, is this idea of egocentrism. When kids are really young, it's natural that they're somewhat egocentric. That egocentrism comes from an inability to see what other people are feeling or thinking, etc. That egocentric behavior actually can kind of does come back as they get into junior high, into early adolescence. Why? Well, a lot of times it comes from the desire to fit in and wondering who you are and the need for acceptance. Suddenly you find yourself looking at yourself a lot, and you're looking at yourself saying, what am I good at? Where do I fit in? Will I fit in? And so actually you start looking at yourself in the mirror a lot more because you're asking questions. Well, what happens in that early adolescence also is that they call the term as imaginary audience, is that you start to believe that you are the center of attention in any situation. That's like when the person walks into a room and they've got a pimple on their forehead, they look like everybody's looking at them. Because when you walk in the room, why wouldn't they be looking at you? So if you have a pimple on your forehead, you become really concerned what people will think because everyone's looking at you and they're all looking at that pimple. Well, they're not. But that's what happens at that time in their life, that imaginary audience. And as you get into older adolescents, they talk about a personal fable, that sometimes they believe they are unique and no one understands exactly how they're experiencing things. And sometimes kids start to think, especially young males, that they are invincible and they can do anything and nothing will happen to them. And as a teacher, you're trying to help them understand, to be able to look big picture, that they are part of a classroom, part of a team, part of a community, and they're struggling because they're thinking that they are different than everyone else and that no one knows exactly what they're feeling. They say that to parents all the time, like, well, the parent will say to the child, I know what you're feeling. I went through that myself. And the students are all they're thinking about is, you don't know. You haven't experienced what I'm experiencing. Well, they really do know a lot of times. Okay. One other thing that the book talks about in Module 4 in Chapter 4 that is important for us to understand as teachers is we want our students to become more emotionally understanding, emotionally aware, for them to start to be able to regulate their own behavior. We talk about emotional learning, and how we develop lessons in a classroom that is going to be sensitive to those, that's a social emotional experience. But one of the things that you notice, and they talk about within the context of morality, moral development, like, who are these kids going to become as adults? And you'll notice that if you look back at the very initial literature that discusses and talks about moral development, you take a look at Piaget, you take a look at Kohlberg, and what you'll notice again is that there are stages that take place, and those stages are kind of tied to students' understanding, their reasoning ability, their cognitive skills, their emotional understanding. And what you see is that kids, let's take Kohlberg for example, he talks about a pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional. And what does that moral understanding look like? Well, when kids are really young, they're very immature, they're very concrete. They look at things really from a right or wrong. They look at it from a very simplistic way. You don't do that because that's wrong, and they're immature thinking. And as they get a little bit older, you'll start to see them go from that external view of the world and to judge moral development that way. And they get to that conventional stage where the conventional stage is they're looking for kind of a social awareness, understanding that we do certain things because, or don't do certain things because they're legally, it's bad. You don't, that's against the social norms. Our community, our police, we don't do that stuff because that's wrong. That's what we as a society judge as wrong, and therefore we don't violate those things. And then eventually, as they get older and more experienced with greater reasoning skills, students start to have this post-conventional idea, which is they start to judge things with a little bit of flexibility. Like, yes, there are most of the time we abide by the rules set in our school, in our community, federally, whatever, because as a society we deem these behaviors to be not good behaviors. But are there times in which we might violate them? And that's kind of where it turns that post-conventional idea, a view of moral development is we judge things on a case-by-case basis. Most of the time, we just kind of go along with what our peers in society judge as being the norms. But there might be times from an internal state that we judge things a certain way, like, oh, maybe it's appropriate to lie here. Because if I didn't lie, I'd really hurt their feelings. And if I hurt their feelings, they're not going to feel a part of this. So maybe this little white lie is not a big deal. Whereas lying under oath or lying generally is not a good thing. Here might be something that I'm actually saving somebody's feelings by doing this. So again, it's this idea of, you wouldn't come to that conclusion if you hadn't realized that sometimes just telling the truth for the truth's sake can be hurtful. And so that's experience. We're going to see that in our students. Their reasoning skills are going to change. You take a look at Carol Gilligan talks about the same stuff as Kohlberg, but she says that, well, one, it was done a lot with males, and the research was, so it's more of a kind of a justice model, like a law and order model, and that maybe if we take a look at it from more of a women's way of knowing kind of thing, Carol Gilligan, that you would be able to understand that there are certain things that we judge things differently based on what is the overall good of the community, meaning that maybe we should look at things from a point of, as a group, and more of a ethic of caring, as opposed to was it morally right by law, okay? And so, but what you notice in Kohlberg or Gilligan or Nancy Eisenberg, they talk about it in chapter 4 as well, is that with within each situation, Eisenberg, it's more pro-social behavior and reasoning and stuff like that. And what you'll notice is, again, when kids are young, they behave this way. And as they get older, they become more mature, they start to recognize that other people have a say. And when they have a say, we have to kind of listen to that, and we incorporate that. And then as we get older, we come to our own conclusions, and that we can be a little bit flexible within our behaviors as it relates to any given situation. So the point is that this stuff, our K through 12, we're going to see very different behaviors based on their ability to reason, their experiences that they've had. And as a teacher, we don't judge a third grader's response to a situation and how they might have hurt somebody's feelings than we would somebody that's a junior. When you're a junior in high school, you're more inclined to understand that what you say and what you do has a different impact than maybe what a first or second grader says or does. And that's why I always love children. Children are generally very unfiltered. So when I come into a room, being in a wheelchair, kids are very unfiltered, like, what happened to you? Why can't you walk? Does that hurt? They just say these things, right? I'm totally cool with that. When kids get older, they start to feel the pressures of society that you don't say certain things because it might hurt somebody's feelings, and so you don't say anything. So then they get into junior high, they don't say anything. They get into high school, they might start to ask a question, but they don't want to ask anything that they might feel that might hurt someone else's feelings. Those are lived experiences telling them that what you say and how you look, by look at me, when you in a certain situation, how you look at people, how you look and what you say and what you feel and how these things manifest impacts a relationship. And so as a teacher, we recognize that we just don't teach stuff, but we also teach kids how to interact with one another and how to develop all of these emotional awareness, emotional understanding, all of that stuff. That's when you take a look at the book, the social emotional learning standards, we have basically 3 general principles. One is caring relationships are the foundation for lasting learning. Okay? So we want to develop, what does it look like to have a positive, healthy, caring relationship amongst peers, between adults, teachers, and students. We need to do that. Secondly, we recognize that emotions affect how and what we learn. So as a teacher, we recognize that when students are in an emotionally vulnerable state, that their learning is going to be hindered. Okay? Third, goal setting and problem solving provides focus, direction, and energy for learning. It is okay and is expected for us as a teachers to incorporate goals and problem solving into our classroom experience rather than just content, because that's going to drive students' participation and student learning. So when you think about our classroom, it is more than just an environment where stuff is learned, but it is an environment that transcends the classroom, where students learn how to work with one another, to be collaborative, to be giving, to be empathetic, okay, to be caring. All of these things are lessons that are going to be learned in the classroom.